Hey guys, welcome back to week 10. So this is officially our last week for the course. Sad times, but also exciting times because now you get to go off on your own and jump into the world of music production with all of these skills that you've learned over the past 10 weeks. So last week we looked at the mixdown stage. So what we have open here, I have my project open where we went through and we applied EQs, compressors, limiters, and then used the returns, some basic saturation and panning. And then we also learned about sidechaining. So now we have a few instruments that are also sidechained to help us bring the mix together a little bit better and to make sure that things don't clash as much. So now that we've gone through the mixdown process, what we're going to look at this week for our last week in week 10 is the mastering process. So what is mastering? Mastering is essentially the last stage when it comes to music production. It's the stage where you balance all of your elements and you bring out as much clarity and punch from your track as possible, while also bringing up its volume to become as loud as possible without compromising too much on the dynamics and squashing the track too much. So the mastering stage, even though it's the final step of the music production process, it's actually not too involved and you don't really want to be doing too much in this stage. Because if you find yourself having to fix up too much at a mastering level, it probably means that you've messed up somewhere down the line in the mixdown stage, or even in your sound selection or the way that you've tried to merge your instruments together. But what I'll be showing you today is how we actually master a track. So we'll be getting this track ready here that I've been making for the past 10 weeks, and we will be doing a master on it using Ableton's native plugins. So whatever Ableton comes with, that's what I'm going to use. I'm also going to quickly introduce you to another plugin that's used for mastering. It is third party, so you do have to purchase it, but that's just for those that are interested in maybe doing a better master on their tracks. Not that Ableton can't do a good job, but there are definitely better plugins out there when it comes to mastering. With that said, it can all be done within Ableton using the built-in audio effects. So that's what I'll be showing you first before we get into showing you some extra plugins that you can use. So let's go through the mastering stage. Now that we've got all our sounds set up and ready to go, we've done a mix down on them. So we've added some EQs, compression to make sure that they're all fitting quite nicely. The first step I do with my master is to make sure that all my tracks are at a reasonable volume level so that nothing is peaking above -5 to 6 decibels on the master here. So I'm just going to play this track. When you're doing this, you want to play the loudest part of the track. So for me, that would be the drop or the chorus. For most of you, it's going to be quite similar as well. So I'm just watching this number here. Okay, so nothing's peaking above what looks like 7 decibels or -7 decibels, which is good. You don't have to bring it up to -5 or 6. That's just the level that I recommend. So if you are below that or slightly below that, that's fine as well. So every single person or every single producer is going to have their own way of mastering a track. And it's very unlikely that you'll find, even two people that use the exact same mastering process, because it does depend on genres, what kind of music you're making, the elements that are in your music, whether you have real instruments or it's very bass heavy, and also depends on how fast your track is. That's all going to determine your process when it comes to mastering. So I'm going to show you the basic method that I would use for most types of music, and then you can alter that to suit your own genre and your own style. So when we master a track, I do like to loop the loudest part of my song over and over again, where the most elements are happening at once. So obviously for me, that's the chorus, where I've got nearly all the elements working at the same time. That will give me a good idea of how it will sound at its limit. Because if I try and master on a really quiet part of the track, it might sound good for there, but then once I listen to the loud part of the track, it might be distorted and crunchy. So we want to make sure that we're listening to it when we have the most instruments happening at once. So after you've set your loop point, so for me that's here. What we're going to be doing is, finally we're going to be jumping onto the master track, so the master channel. This is where all of our instruments are going into. So whatever we're hearing from here is coming out of the master. So all of our instruments, our drums, also our returns, they all get routed to the master channel, which is then what comes out in the final mix that we can hear. So if we take a look at our returns, you can can see that they're going to the master. And then if you look at all of our tracks, they are all set to master. And this is how Ableton works by default, because that's generally what you want at the end of the day. You want a way to be able to affect all your tracks at once, and that is this track here, our master track. The mastering generally consists of very minor things, but essentially you'll be using a compressor and a limiter, the EQ, maybe a touch of saturation. But apart from that, you're not really going to be going too crazy with audio effects, and you don't want to be on the master channel. Let's begin our master chain down here on our master track. So double click your master track, and then you'll see we can drop our audio effects in here. So I'm going to start off with an EQ. I'm going to grab an EQ8. The first thing I'm going to be doing on this is a really harsh high pass. So I'm going to be using the 4x high pass here. Now I'm going to bring it right down to 10 Hertz. And then I'm just going to slowly increase this frequency here until too much of the bass gets chopped out, and then I'm going to tone it back from there. Now obviously this stage does help if you have decent speakers that you can hear these lower frequencies. If you are on something where you can't hear anything below 50, I'd probably just recommend it leaving this at around the 20 to 30 mark. That way you're not chopping off too much of the sub region. So what I'm going to do is drop this right down, just bring this up slowly. Okay, for me, I'm going to leave that about there. So the whole point of doing this is just to get rid of frequencies that aren't audible to the human ear. So we really don't need this information right down here. And getting rid of that will help us when it comes to limiting the track, so we have more headroom to work with. We don't have these frequencies down here trying to compete in the mix as well. And you can even do this for the top end. So I'm going to use a low pass, 4x harsh low pass up here. I'm going to drag this right up. You can see if I bring it down too much, we're just filtering the whole track, and that's exactly what we don't want. So I'm going to push it back up. I'm not going to chop off too much, I'm just going to leave it here, maybe the 15k mark. I really don't want to roll off those highs, purely to give us a little more headroom and just get rid of unwanted frequencies. Okay, next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add another EQ in. So this is doing our cutoff here. I'm going to leave this. And now what I'm going to do with this other EQ is just find any parts of the track, or sorry, frequencies in the track that don't sound good to us. So the way we can do that is just to crank this up. So we did this with the EQ project, or the EQ exercises a few weeks ago. What I like to do is just crank up the gain, turn up the resonance so it's a very fine line. Then I'm going to hit this headphone icon here, and you won't hear it until you actually click on the dot. So if I don't click on the dot, I can hear all the frequencies just with that accented obviously. But if I want to just narrow down on what this section here is hearing, I can just click on the dot and hold it. And now I'm only hearing that frequency range. So this is really handy for finding those foul frequencies that are just piercing the ears in a bad way, or they just don't sound good in our mix. So we can really narrow down in that section and then use that to pull them out. So I'm going to go through here, sweep through, find any parts that I don't like, and then I'm going to pull them out slightly. So because I did the mix down already on most of my instruments, it's nothing really too bad and jumping out at me for this stage. There's just this little peak here at around the 1.3 kilohertz mark for me. I'm just going to dip that back ever so slightly. So I suggest you do this as well. Use an EQ. Turn on the little headphone icon for one of your points, and then you can click and drag it around so that you can narrow down on the frequency range. If you find something that's really jumping out at you that sounds bad, You can use this technique, and what I'm going to do now for this point here, I don't like that tone there, so I've narrowed it down. I'm going to bring the gain back down, and then I'm going to slightly open the bandwidth here. No more than 5 decibels for me. I think that's fine. If you have a really loud, obnoxious sound that you want to get rid of, or frequency range, feel free to chop off a little bit more, but you don't want to take away too much from the master of the track. So for me, I'm going to leave this at -5 or around there. And it's just getting rid of that small frequency range that I wasn't liking there. Again, this is only subtle. I'm not completely chopping out that range or anything like that. It's just to add a little bit more clarity to your track. Okay, now that we've EQ'd that, I'm going to add in a compressor, but I'm not actually going to use the compressor. I'm going to introduce you to this one here. So it's called a glue compressor. I'm just going to drag this on. The difference between the compressor and the glue compressor is that, like its name, the glue compressor works extremely well at bringing elements together. So not a single sound, so actually compressing multiple instruments and sounds together and essentially gluing them in a way. So it's modeled off of a very popular compressor back in the 80s, and the characteristics were just lend themselves really well to using them on multiple instruments. So Ableton has taken that glue compressor and turned it into an audio effect. I also find that it's a little bit smoother than a normal compressor in the way it works, and you can kind of push it a little bit harder without sacrificing too much quality. So you can see here it's Cytomic. So Cytomic actually worked with Ableton in creating this compressor, which was based off of the SSL bus compressor back in the 80s, so the actual hardware version. What I like to do with this glue compressor is I like to set the attack quite high, so 10 milliseconds or thereabouts, and then I like to set the release quite low on the master chain. If I was using this in another scenario, like not on the master chain, so if I was using it on an instrument, or let's say a mix between vocals and synths, then I could push this a little harder and have the attack a little bit quicker. The reason I have the attack a little bit slower on this one is so it doesn't mess with my transients too much. So I don't actually want to push down anything, any of those kicks or hard hits too much, because I've already done what I needed to in the mixing stage. This compressor is just to bring those elements together a little bit better, so bring all my instruments together and just to glue everything overall. So to make it a little more subtle, I like to push up the attack and also have the release a little bit quicker so that the compressor doesn't hang around too long. I like to leave makeup off. So essentially I'm going to bring down the threshold here until I start to get some gain reduction. Okay, that's more than enough gain reduction for me on the master chain. So I'm sitting on about 2 to 3 decibels of gain reduction overall, and you really don't want to be having more than that on your master channel. Otherwise, it can sound, you can start to really squash the track a little too much. Like I was saying, you're going to get that sausage effect. So it's just some subtle compression to bring down any peaks that are occurring when multiple sounds are playing on top of each other, and just to bring things together overall. I'm going to bring the makeup just a little bit here, because we've cut out all those lower frequencies and also this this little frequency range here that I didn't like, and we've also compressed it slightly. We're sitting much lower now in the mix. The overall volume has dropped probably about 2 or 3 decibels there. So I'm just going to bring some of that back with the makeup on the glue compressor. Okay, so I've got 2 EQs happening now, and then I've got my glue compressor, which is bringing everything together. Now I'm going to add a limiter. So I'm going to drag a limiter on. Before I limit this and before I do anything else, I'm just going to go back and make sure that my basses are mono. So I've got the drums here, and here's my kick. What I'm going to do is actually just mono this entire kick itself. To do that, I'm going to drag a utility onto it. This is probably something I should have done in the mixdown stage. I actually think I did mono it back in the project, but I can't remember, so we'll just do it in here to make sure. So to mono a sound, we can either go to mono here, or we can go to bass mono. So I have explained mono and stereo width before, but I'm just going to explain it a little bit more now. So like I was saying, I think it was last week when I was saying that if you have things, swirling around, like if you have your kick and your bass panning left and right, that's really going to affect how the listener hears it on a bigger system, or even when they're just listening to it in the car or on headphones. You want to have those lower frequencies quite centered, so then it doesn't matter where you are or whatever ear or whatever speaker you're listening to, you're going to get those bass frequencies. If you start panning those off, it can make your track sound a lot less structured, and it will have a lot less impact if those lower frequencies are moving around. So typically what you want to do is mono everything below, any bass frequency, so most things below 120 to 150-ish. That way those are going to be consistent no matter where you hear it. I'm going to bring up an image now just to explain mono and stereo a little bit better. So if you look at the first picture up the top, you can see that when we set things to mono, it doesn't matter if it's coming out of the left or the right, it's going to be the same signal. So it's essentially one mono signal being split into those two speakers, or however many speakers you got. If you've got a bigger speaker system, it's going to be exactly the same on all those speakers. As soon as you have stereo information, if we look at the bottom picture now, that's stereo. Now channel A or left and right are completely different. So you can have different information going to the left and right channel, like I demonstrated when we had the delay and the chorus, and how we're panning things off in here as well with the left and right channels. If you're wearing headphones, you can hear that they're completely different in the left and right ear. So one thing to be aware of in the mixdown and mastering stage is that you can make use of the stereo width. Even though we want most of our bass frequencies mono, that doesn't mean we want the rest mono as well. If the entire track is mono, it's going to sound extremely plain and very boxy and, quite boring as well. It's not going to have any of that shift between the left and right ear. It's going to be exactly the same. I'll demonstrate that on my track here. So I'm going to put a utility on my master. Let's listen to how this track sounds in stereo first. So I'm not going to do anything. Now I'm going to flick the mono switch on and play the track. I'm going to flick it off now. Back on. I'm just going to switch it on and off. Okay, so I'm sure you can hear how much better it sounds in stereo. So we don't want our track to be entirely mono because it's going to sound extremely boring, and we want to make use of that stereo width that we have. With that being said, we do want the track to still sound good when it's monoed. So if you're hitting this button here, if you're testing this on your own track and you've got a utility on it, and you're pressing the mono switch on and off, and your track completely changes when you press the mono switch. So if you notice on my track, it changes, but not to the extent where it sounds terrible and it's completely different. We still get the general gist of the track. We can hear most of the elements. It's just that some of that nice separation between left and right is gone, but the information is still there and the track is still sounding how it should. So it's one thing to be really aware of when you are making a track. If you're pressing this button here and your track completely changes to the point where it doesn't sound anything like it used to, it's probably because you have pushed those sounds too far left and right, and all your sounds are pushed out to the sides too much. So you just need to find that nice balance between having a track that sounds good in mono while having stereo information. So I hope that makes sense. This is a really good technique you can use, is just to mono your track and make sure it still sounds good, or as good as it can be without having that nice stereo balance. But you should still be able to get the general idea of what the track is. Like I was saying, a lot of people listen to songs on their phones, on their phone speakers, and most of those are mono. I did have a look, and I think some are stereo now, but the majority are still mono, so they're going to be listening to it like this. Which is unfortunate because we've gone to all this effort to do some nice stereo imaging to add balance to our left and right ears, and to pan things off to make it more interesting, and then someone goes and listens to it on an iPhone speaker. But that's just how life goes sometimes. Things are getting better, so people are listening to music on, from better sources, on better headphones and earphones. The earphones that come with phones now are getting much better as well. Hopefully one day in the near future, everyone will be listening to music on high quality earphones or headphones. That way all that the work we do in our tracks doesn't go to waste. I'm going to show you how this works as well in a third-party plugin really soon, so you'll be able to see it much clearer. Coming back to our kick, I'm going to bass mono this. So I was going to mono the whole thing. Actually, I will mono the whole thing. So all I'm going to do is hit the mono button on this kick. If I turn off the mono and start to add width, you can see how it's just lost a lot of impact now. I'm going to leave the kick mono, and then I'm going to do the same for my bass as well. I'm going to put a utility on the end. This one, I'm going to bass mono it. I'm going to do it for around 150 Hertz. So now it still has some stereo information above 150 Hertz. There'll be differentiation between the left and right ear, but for everything under 150, it will be mono, so it'll be the same. That way all the sub frequencies are mono, which is what we want. So you don't have to completely mono your bass if you've got some information up here, or if you've got a crunchier bass which has some higher frequencies, you can still have some stereo width to them, but it's just recommended that you have them monoed below, around this mark, so that all your subs and those low end frequencies are mono. You can also go through and do this to any other elements that you think are, the most prominent in your track. So if you want your clap to be mono or mostly mono, you can do that as well. That way the clap is very centered. But I'm just going to leave it how it is. I don't think it has much stereo information anyway. So I've got my kick and bass mono now. I'm going to come back to my master channel. And I'm just going to put another utility on it here. And I'm actually just going to do an entire bass mono. And I'm going to set this one slightly lower. So I'm going to set it to about 100. Now, any frequency, doesn't matter what instrument it is, below this point will be mono. This is optional. I'm just doing this to make sure that my basses are in the center. Now that we have that sorted, we can come back to our limiter now. So this is essentially the very final step when it comes to mastering. This is what's going to give us the final volume output. And what we'll be doing is pushing this gain up. So we'll be leaving our ceiling at -3. If you want, you can set this to 0 decibels. If you want to squeeze that extra 0.3 of a decibel volume out. But what we're going to be doing is pushing up this gain until we start to get some gain reduction. And then we'll be judging how much gain reduction we actually want, depending on how the track sounds. As a general guide, essentially you just push this up until it sounds bad or distorted. So I'm going to do that now. So we're on the loudest part of the track, make sure we're doing that. Okay, for me that's about there. So I've got mine set to 14 decibels of gain, and there's usually, it's mostly sitting at around -5 decibels of gain reduction, which is definitely on the higher end. You don't really want more than 5 to 6 decibels of gain reduction here. If you find that your track is still quiet, let's say you listen to another commercial track in a similar genre to yours, and yours is very quiet compared to that track, that means you probably have to come back to this stage here, the mix down stage, and just get your sounds to work a little better together, especially if you start peaking above 6 decibels of gain reduction. You definitely shouldn't be seeing that too often. If you're finding that it's spiking above -6 decibels of reduction only once every so often, maybe try and narrow that down and figure out which sound is causing that. And then you probably find that you've got some frequency clashes where two sounds are trying to compete too much, and that's what will cause this to spike. So I probably wouldn't push this one much more than 14.2 decibels of gain here. I'm getting a nice amount of reduction without it being too harsh, and I'm avoiding a lot of distortion. So if you push this harder, at this point it's just crazy, and you can hear how much distortion's coming through. So I'm going to back it off. So I'm still getting a nice amount of limiting at this point, but I'm not destroying the track. That's really what you're looking for when you're mastering it, is just to not... You shouldn't be doing too much at this stage, like I mentioned. This stage is usually just to do very minor cleanup. You don't want to be pushing frequencies here and there. Let's say if you find that your track is really muddy, and you start doing this to try and fix it, and then maybe adding some highs. You shouldn't be doing this in the mastering stage. That probably means that you have to go back to your mix down, so what we did last week, and then fixing it up in that stage. So actually fixing up your elements in here, rather than trying to fix it as a whole on your master chain. So my master chain is quite light. It's essentially just a couple of EQs. I've got my glue compressor just to bring my instruments together. Utility here with just the bass mono. And then finally I've got my limiter with around 5 to 6 decibels of reduction. So at this point, after we've done all this, your track is basically finished. So what you're hearing now is essentially the final product. If you find that you're listening to your track, and what I recommend is actually referencing another track, a commercially released song in your genre, or similar style to what you're making, and then just find the differences between the two. If you find that your song is way off quality-wise, don't be too hard on yourself. I mean, we're just using Ableton's built-in plugins. A lot of people go through mastering engineers who have 30 years of mastering experience, and they have a bunch of hardware, analog hardware, which they run the songs through, and they sit there for, essentially days tweaking every single frequency. Especially in the mixdown stage, with the mixdown engineers, they would sit there fine-tuning frequencies depending on who the artist is, but just be aware that a lot of commercially released tracks have a lot of money behind them, so don't be too hard on yourself if you can't. If your track doesn't sound exactly like a radio-released commercial song, it's just impossible to compete with all that money and hardware they have behind them. But that doesn't mean you can't get something sounding good just from Ableton itself with the built-in plugins. A lot of it does come down to your sound selection, your instruments, and how they're blending with each other, and whether how much time you put into the mixdown process in getting those sounds to work with each other. So just go through your track as well and make sure it all sounds good in all different sections. Even though we've mastered prominently for the chorus, because that's the loudest part of our track and we've mastered for that, the rest should fit around it pretty nicely as well. But just make sure by flicking through. So once we have this done, we have our mastering done here, and we're happy with how it's sounding, we can finally move on to the final step. So we need to make sure that our playhead or our loop marker here is set for the entire track so that we're not chopping anything off. Just make sure that the end point is set exactly to where you want the track to finish as well, because this is going to determine your final, your final track length. So I'm going to set it to here. Actually quite a bit of space at the end here. I'm just going to chop it a little bit shorter. Just having this extra little bit of space here when the final hit plays just gives enough time for the reverb to ring out as well. We don't want to chop that short. Okay, once you have your loop marker set correctly, make sure you're getting the start of the track as well, so the very beginning. We're finally ready to export this. So I always like to select my loop marker before I export it. I've found sometimes Ableton freaks out and doesn't export the actual length. So just select the loop marker. Then we go up to File, Export. Now this time, rendered track, we do want it to be the master. So for our mix down, we did the selected tracks. This time we're actually exporting the master, so the final product. Just check your render and start length, it all looks good. Now it's up to you what you want to do here. For me, if I was just exporting this for me to listen to it on some speakers or just to test my track, I would just have that MP3 on like this. So all this would be off, exactly like this, and I would leave MP3 on, and that will spit out a 320 kilobytes MP3. But if you want a high quality output, you do want to encode PCM, and then we want to leave it as wave, 24 bits, and then once again just leave no dither. So you can have both of these on as well. So what this will do is export a wave file, which will be, depending on the length of your track, somewhere around the 40 to 50 megabytes size, and then it will spit out the MP3 as well. Usually it's around 10 megabytes or less at 320, depending on your track length. But for this, I'm going to have wave on and also MP3 on, and then I'm going to hit export. So once again, make sure you name your track and that it's exporting it to the location that you want. I'm going to call this Lusive Arts Master, and I'm just going to hit save. Now that's going to go through and export a wave and an MP3 file, and we'll come back once it's done that. Okay, so mine's finished exporting. I've just found it here. So we've got the MP3 file, which this one turned out at 5.2 meg. This is quite a short track, so it's only just over 2 minutes long. Yours will probably be bigger than that, depending on the length of your track. And I got the WAV file, which is close to 40 meg. So the WAV file is the one that you want to use if you are, uploading the track to be released, using a releasing platform, or if you're sending it to a record label, whatever you want to do. If you want the high quality version, you're going to use the WAV file. Whereas if you're putting it on SoundCloud, or sending it to friends, or you want to put it on another service where you just want to listen to it, you can just use the MP3 file and that would be fine. But yeah, those are our two exports. That was it. We've covered mastering now. Our track is completely exported, it's finished, and it's ready to be released. So we have our final product ready to go. We've got the WAV and the MP3 file. And yeah, we're ready to throw this thing out into the real world. So that covers video 1 for this week. I just wanted to show you what mastering is, what the process is, and how we can do it inside of Ableton using built-in audio effects. Next video, we're going to look at another plugin that I would use for mastering, and just a really quick way to use that. Should you wish to want a third-party plugin that will give you a little bit of a nicer result out of Ableton, I would highly recommend this one. So we're going to cover that, and we're also going to cover a few things that we haven't covered in the course yet. So some techniques and effects that I like to use, which you might find handy. Just a couple of cool little tips there. So I hope you enjoyed this video on mastering inside of Ableton, and I'll catch you for video 2.